Hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. My name is Jalen, and today I'm talking about all the books that I read in October. Before we get into the books, I am drinking an interesting beer. It's called Chai Jolly. It is a dark wheat beer with chai spices. I had this one the other night, and it was very good. And it's still very good. Like chai tea beer, basically. It's very, very yummy. I love how this channel is me just like showing you beers from one brewery that you probably can't buy unless you live in Arizona. I'm a flop. I'm sorry. I'm going to try to switch it up, add more wine. Someone in my last video in the comments said, I wish you'd do more wine, so noted. So, what did I read? I feel like I had a not as great reading month. I feel like it was very slow, and maybe I was just like busy. I feel like I was reading all the time though, but like it just wasn't the best month, I would say, for reading. So, I guess I'll start with the disappointment of the month. It is The Morning Star by Karl of Knausgaard. I DNF'd this book. Rare thing on my channel. I DNF'd it at page 257. Okay, so I was excited about this book because I saw a bunch of authors that I really liked were, one, very hyped about this book, and also, two, when the reviews started coming in, it seemed to be a lot of high praise. Some early reviews that I saw said that it was like kind of like a Stephen King-ish novel, super dark, kind of like a horror bent, and I never read Karl of Knausgaard. He's the author of the very famous My Struggle series. I think there's 6 books in it, and it's autofictional. People seem to love this guy. So I was very hyped going into it, but I will say it wasn't doing it for me. It was highly, highly plotty. So before I get ahead of myself, this book is about a bunch of people that are living in Norway. We shift perspectives in every chapter, and there is a star that has appeared in the sky that has started to impact these people's lives. Seems to be kind of like pre-end of the world vibes. Not really sure what the star is doing, what's happening, but it's kind of like this, I guess, like demonic entity that is like coming to the world and is playing with people. And so you see all these people moving through their lives and the minutia of it, dealing with various vices. Notably, alcoholism is covered quite extensively in the book from what I read. So we like see all these characters, it starts to introduce all of them, and it felt to me like this book was Karl of Knausgaard having an idea for a novel, right? And he's sitting down, he's like, I'm going to write this book, like a pre-apocalyptic book about a star appearing in the sky and it's going to affect a bunch of people, and I'm going to see how it plays out, right? Great premise. I mean, how are novels born, but not for an idea and sitting down at your computer? But I do think that it felt like he didn't know where he was going with the story. He was just like, he had a new character, and he's like, all right, what am I going to do with this one? Okay, he's going to be in this relationship, and he's going to have these kids, and then I'm going to throw this kind of weird stuff going in because of the star in the sky to make sure people remember that this is like in a pre-apocalyptic novel, and then I'm going to have him kind of spiral and drink a lot, and then he's going to be like he was just like, it just doesn't feel contained, it doesn't feel like it was edited really. It felt a bit all over the place, and from what I'm gathering from like reviews and interviews with him is that this book is looking a lot at faith and death, namely, and I guess near the end of the book there's like a long chapter that's basically an essay about death. And so I think that that's an interesting premise. I like reading about these kind of things. I love, kind of like a weird speculative book, but this one, the way it was written, just wasn't doing it for me. It just really felt like, I know like Stephen King writes a lot of his books in which he doesn't know how it's going to end, and I mean that's totally fine. I hate when a book feels completely just like chaos. In terms of like, I can read a book that feels chaotic, but feels like it's intentional. It feels like it knows where it's going, it knows what it's doing. Like it feels like the author has considered it and edited it down, and like, do you know what I'm saying? But this book did not have that feeling to it. It just felt very name soupy. It felt not even overly ambitious, just wasn't executed well. It was just like fact spewing about each of the characters, and it wasn't really like, it wasn't giving me the zhuzh. It wasn't like, I just couldn't read anymore. I was like, you know what? I'm over it. And I hear this one is the start of a trilogy as well that I won't be reading, I don't think. Okay, switching gears. I had a 5-star read. It was The Deeper the Water, the Uglier the Fish by Katya Apekina. This book came out in 2018 on $2 Radio, which is a smaller, I think they're an indie press. And I really, really enjoyed this book. It was amazing. I must say, it actually did something similar to the Karl of Knausgaard book, in which we have a bunch of different characters and perspectives that shift between each chapter, but this one did it well. Let me not drag Karl's entire video. I'm sorry, but this book did it really well. So this book follows 2 sisters who I think are teenagers. Their mother has just attempted suicide, and she is in the hospital and not sure if she's going to make it through, and they're sent to live with their father, who they haven't seen since I think he left their house when they were young kids. And so the older sister finds her mother hanging from a noose, and they're living in Louisiana. So after all this happens, they're sent to New York to live with their estranged father, who is a writer, and he was a former civil rights activist. And you kind of understand that the older daughter believes that the father is to blame for her mother attempting suicide, and the way that she holds that against him in trying to create like a new family amongst the three of them. And the younger daughter does not feel the same way, and she starts to seek affection from her father in ways that... Yikes. I don't want to spoil this book, but I'm trying to think of how I can explain it without giving too many spoilers. Basically, the daughter's affection for the father becomes a little too intense. And so you see this divide between the sisters. And so I think this book is, generally rooted in family, but most notably, I would say the connection between sisters and the ways that can be very fraught in light of trauma and grief, and processing that, and how different siblings can process that in a much different way, and the divide that causes between siblings and whether they can actually come together through it, or what can kind of happen if things don't go as well. This book, I want to spoil it so bad because there's so much going on in this book that it's so worthy and rich to discuss, but in terms of this shifting perspectives, what's really cool here is the older daughter, it's told in the present time of all the action happening. And the younger daughter, it's written from the future, and so she's reflecting on the past and what happened. And so I really like that, but also there are so many just side characters that are sprinkled throughout the text, and you get to see their perspective for maybe like a page or two. And while this can seemingly be, ineffective on paper, I really liked it because it lent itself to get further and deeper into the minds of the characters. And so you get different takes on what's happening in the action of the plot from a bunch of different people, so you can kind of see through certain facades or thought patterns of other characters to really see the truth of what's happening here, which I thought was so good. It kind of cut through some of the unreliable narrator tropiness that I tend to not like. It can be fun to read, but I really liked how this book really parsed through the psychological aspects of all of these issues of trauma, grief, processing all of that, family, and yeah, I thought it was so good. I would say this book felt very similar in tone to Hereditary, the movie. I saw a review on Goodreads that mentioned that, and I was like, yeah, it's not like demonic possession, but like the grief vibes, the processing of trauma, and things going very south in the midst of all that is very similar to Hereditary, I would say. It's very dark, beautifully written, and this is a debut, and I don't think she's written anything else since then, but I'm hoping that she's still working on something because I thought this was phenomenal. All right. Next, I read the new Fernanda Melchor book called Paradais, and I loved Hurricane Season by Fernanda Melchor. It was one of my favorite books of 2020. It was in my top 10. She writes in this way that is just a barrage of text at you. She doesn't really use paragraph breaks. She just gives you the unrelenting prose and just bleak, brutal aspects of living in poverty in Mexico, and the ways that toxic masculinity, femicide, homophobia, pedophilia, incest, how all these issues play out in the midst of, these different power dynamics underlying it all, the corruption that comes from capitalism and living in poverty. I say this because these themes are very much present in this text as well. However, this is more of a novella than a novel. It's very short. So we follow these two teenagers that one of them, he works at this luxury housing complex, and the other kid, he actually lives there, so he's rich. So there's this clear dynamic of rich versus poor, and these two, they're not friends per se, but they drink together all the time. And so the rich kid, his name is Franco, and he is overweight, he is addicted to porn, and he talks a lot to the other kid who works there as a gardener. Basically, the gardener kid, I forget his name, I'm blanking on it right now, but he basically is using the rich kid to get alcohol, basically to cope with his very poor home life outside of this luxury housing complex. And the general gist of what happens here is the two boys start scheming when the rich kid becomes obsessed with his neighbor, who was a married woman, who I think she's like kind of famous, celebrity, and he starts to plan out raping her basically. And so, this book is similarly incredibly bleak and dark, and you're holding the book like away from you, like what is about to happen in this book. And I'll let you find out for yourself. Trigger warnings, of course, like any Fernanda Melchor book. Clearly, going forward, it's a lot, basically. I really love this book though because I really liked the interesting dynamic between these two teenagers, and you see one who is clearly, he has substance abuse problems, and the ways that he's using this dynamic to be complicit in the development of a crime, trying to cope with living in a narco-controlled village, and his mother who is quite overbearing, in the ways that he's abused at home and under constant threat of violence, how he seeks solace in his job as a gardener, but he also hates it and tries to cope with it through substances, and the ways that he falls into this scheme, and also the ways that the rich kid, how his sense of entitlement and also coping with being a fat teenager, how he feels he's owed sex from this woman. And another book that I read this month, I'll talk about it later, called The Right to Sex, was a perfect pairing of the two in terms of looking at incels basically and the ways that they feel that they are owed sex and what they'll do, basically engage in rape to get it. It's a lot, man. It was a lot to read, but I loved the way that Fernanda Melchor parsed through it. In this book, it was short, but it felt very similar to Hurricane Season. I like seeing her do a very linear story in a very short manner. I like seeing a different side of Melchor's writing despite it being very similar in tone and theme. If you liked Hurricane Season, definitely check this one out. I'd almost guarantee that you'll like it as well. But again, trigger warnings going into it, and by the end of it, it's just yikes. That's all I can really say about it. I want to read the ending again though, because it was very holy shit, what's happening, it's wild. So it was unputdownable. You can probably read this in a sitting as well. So that one comes out in March. I want to say March 1st in the US. Yes, March 1st, from New Directions, who we love. And the cover, oh my god, so good. All right, next up, I read another dark book. Lots of darkness this month. It was called No Longer Human by Osamu Dazai. In this book, it seems to be highly read. It has a lot of reviews on Goodreads. I've been seeing it, where did I see it? There's a ton of copies at Barnes & Noble. I've been seeing it on TikTok and stuff, and I heard that it's very, very dark. And I know Junji Ito, who does manga, he has a manga version of this, I guess. he based the story and made it more kind of dark and fleshed out with illustrations, of course. And so basically this is a depressed man moving, which is, I usually read depressed women moving novels, DWMs. This is a DMM for sure. We follow a man who's living in Japan who is severely, severely, severely depressed. This book is considered to be the author's suicide note. So again, trigger warnings going into this one. I was kind of mixed on this book, but overall, the pros definitely outweigh the cons. I think that this book looks at disassociation and loneliness and not understanding people around you so well, and it was so at times hard to read. The intro to this book, in which a narrator, I don't know, I'm blanking on how that played out. I think there's a narrator who's looking at pictures of the main narrator in the story, and he is looking at the ways that this man appears to be devoid of a soul, how creepy and just devastating that is. And it was described so well, and I was just it creeped me out just in the sense of imagining what those photographs would look like. So I want to check out the Junji Ito version to see how he does that. But so then we get a look at this man's life and the way that he moves through childhood and into adulthood, and the ways that he suffers from abuse and just general, misunderstandings from his peers, and the ways that he processes all these things and overthinks a ton and tries to grapple with his identity, even though he feels like he's not human. He feels like he shouldn't be here, and the ways that he handles that. This book, I don't really have anything too, intelligent or insightful to say about it. I will just say that it was an experience, and it was very, very bleak, very depressing, and it was kind of crazy. I felt a little called out at certain times in terms of my own introvertedness and thoughts that I've engaged in, and it kind of spooked me to that in that sense. And so there's a lot of things in here to self-identify with that was really interesting to think through. The one thing I didn't like about this book is that I think a lot of the plot in the middle, the actual linear storytelling of it, it was kind of scattered and wasn't really a well-paced or told story, I guess, but all of the ideas and reflections were brilliant. So I think from a novel perspective, it wasn't my favorite, but in terms of a book of ideas, thoughts, the themes engaged with here, I really loved all of that. Super devastating, and kind of makes you reassess your understanding of people around you and what they can actually be grappling with that doesn't really appear on the surface, because this character, he presents a very like jovial, always putting on a smile, but on the inside is completely devastated and depressed, and it just makes you think a lot. So that was that one. Next up, I read a horror novel. It just came out. It's called This Thing Between Us by Gus Moreno. This one was wild, and I really, really liked it. It was a debut novel that I think the marketing is a little bit off for this book. It's pitched as this like haunted Alexa robot novel in terms of like some weird things going on with your Alexa and starting to talk to you, and the ways that it plays on this couple. I think the book is more so rooted in grief and processing trauma when our main character, his girlfriend or wife, I forget, she tragically dies, and the book is completely rooted in this man's processing of the grief in the loss of his partner, and there seems to be strange things happening to them and then just him. There seems to be a haunting going on in the ways in which it is playing on his grief in order to kind of come into the world. I don't want to spoil anything in this book, but it does get quite, like, I wasn't expecting it to go places it did because of the marketing. Like, so it starts with the Alexa device. It's called an Itza, I think. She starts playing weird music at odd hours of the night. She starts projecting things, speaking things. It goes way beyond just the Alexa. So that's just like the start of the novel. I think it's kind of to mislead you, but you see the ways in which this man is processing his grief and this weird supernatural things that are happening around him. And you see him battling an evil force, it seems, and how he does that, or whether it's all a figment of his imagination and just a way of him processing the grief that's occurring. And it kind of blends supernatural aspects with really gorgeous reflections on grief. Gorgeous is probably not the right word, just really moving, I guess, passages on grief and what that looks like when you lose the person that's closest to you. I think a proper description of this book is like Black Mirror meets Pet Sematary meets Joan Didion, I guess. So yeah, that was that one. It was really good. If you're looking for some horror, definitely check that one out. It's very short as well. Next up, I have another disappointment. It was Harlem Shuffle by Colson Whitehead. I loved The Nickel Boys by him, and this one I did not love, and I think it sorta put me in a reading slump that I think is still happening, which is unfortunate. So this one follows a man named Ray Carney. This is a book set in the late 50s and early 60s in Harlem, New York. And he is a furniture salesman who begins to operate as a fence in various heists. And so this book is looking a lot at the difference between a crook versus a striver, and what, in particular, black men in New York at this time had to do or were felt compelled to do in order to move ahead in capitalism under white supremacy, and using this one character by the name of Ray Carney to really analyze how that looks for him and really get at this interesting distinction between whether he is a criminal or a bad person for engaging in this criminal behavior, or whether he is just doing what he needs to do to provide for his family. He even himself is kind of questioning or tries to justify the things that he's doing. And so I loved all of those aspects of the book. I really loved this kind of reflection on crook versus striver, and how, like, under capitalism, how certain people are allowed to get away with that while certain people are not. And so love that, and love this kind of setup for a story. However, I thought this book was like just grueling for me to read. It's told in a very non-linear, kind of fragmentary prose style, in which, like, he'll jump back in time and give, like, he'll say something about a character that, or just like mention a character that you don't know who it is, and you're like, wait, did I miss something? And then he'll give like backstory of what he was just saying, and then go back into the plot. And I'm like, and it did that a lot. Like, he would just jump back in time, come back, or he would reflect on something that he's mentioning and then go back into the dialogue. Like, it was jarring for me to read, and I couldn't really get into a flow with it. And he writes in some like fragments that I didn't love. And so just on a prose level, it was hard for me to get through. It was very hard to follow at times. The actual heist, so this book is told in 3 like novellas, basically, involving 3 different crimes or heists that go on, all following Ray Carney over like the course of 5 years, I want to say. I like how the first novella is a very like micro heist at this certain hotel, and then it kind of gets more broad by the end of it, looking at a heist following the murder of a black boy at the hands of police and the riots that are occurring in Harlem in 1964, and looking at more like systemic criminal activity. And I love that. I love this. So there's a lot of things I like here, but just the execution was not it for me. If a book is not enjoyable for me to read, like, even if the ideas are there, even if I like some of the characters, like, I just couldn't get past it. So Did not love that book. Okay, and last but certainly not least, this is the book I was mentioning previously. It is called The Right to Sex, Feminism in the 21st Century by Amia Srinivasan. And this book blew my brain. It was so good. This is a perfect book to add to your nonfiction November TBR. Please read this, all of you that are watching it. It is so good. It was a blast to read. I mean, this book grapples with a ton of difficult subject matter. However, it really felt like kind of like a conversation with the reader, but in this very like essayistic, well-researched, impeccably presented collection of essays. But it really feels like Amia is battling with herself on all of these topics and really trying to get to an answer, even though she feels quite ambivalent in all of these essays. It then for the reader also makes you question yourself and question your thoughts on these topics and where you fall, and kind of trying to get to a conclusion, but really asking so many questions about the current state of feminism in light of the internet age, and really reflecting on the different ways of feminism leading up to now, and where do we go from here. The centerpiece of it is an essay called The Right to Sex, in which she looks at incels and the ways that they feel that they are owed sex. And more generally, she then from there reflects on desire generally and how we frame our desires. So for me personally, I thought it was interesting that she reflects on certain aspects of like grinder culture. So my gays out there, when the gays are on there and they're like no fats, no femmes, no Asians, no blacks, how those ideas play out in a philosophical framework of which people say like, no, it's just a preference, or it's just what I personally desire, and how people feel a right to those desires, but what are those desires really rooted in, and questioning those behaviors. And so that's like basically the centerpiece of the collection. But she also has some really brilliant essays throughout here. One of them is about talking to her students about pornography, which I think was my favorite essay in the collection. It was so good in the ways that she's a professor herself, and she was surprised to hear her students' response to how they viewed pornography, because generally people are, in the current age, who are more, I guess, leftist, are very pro-pornography, think that people should have the right to do whatever they want. Now with like OnlyFans, people having, personal ways of selling pornography that they make themselves and kind of taking back ownership from big companies, how people generally are pro-porn. But she was surprised to find a lot of her students found that it was, objectifying women, merely a mechanism to serve men, and kind of finding the balance between those two beliefs and figuring out what pornography means to feminism now, and what like a proper way of administering porn would be from a feminist angle. And then another one that I really liked was looking at carceralism and sex. So thinking about criminalization of prostitution versus not. Oh, and then one that was so good as well was one about the argument for professors not sleeping with their students. Essay basically argues against the idea of consent being sufficient for a professor-student relationship to be considered okay, and really unpacking the reasons behind why she thinks that is not the case. So that was one essay where I felt like she had a strong position. The other ones are a little bit more ambivalent in certain aspects, but they all do get to some sort of conclusion. But I feel like that one was very like, she's very against the idea of a professor-student relationship. It was just really interesting reading about her thought processes on it, and like really thinking about different feminist thought and figuring out what is best under those different theories. I really enjoyed thinking through these questions. It kind of felt like I was a student trying to work my brain and trying to get an answer to these questions. So overall, I loved it, if you can't tell. One of the best nonfiction books I think I've ever read, to be honest. It was very mind-opening, and I think I will say it is such a smart book, but it is very accessible. But I do think I'm not doing it justice at all, so I would just say read it if any of what I just said sounded interesting to you, if you want to think through these questions. I really had a good time with it and learned a lot from it as well. Let me know what your favorite read of the month was. Oh, I will say another reason why this month felt kind of slow was because like the last week and a half, I want to say, I've been reading this bad boy, The Corrections by Jonathan Franzen. I'm also working on a Lauren Vandenberg story collection, but this book is almost 600 pages and the text is quite small. And it's a big-brained, dense family saga that I'm really enjoying. I was kind of coming off the slump from Harlem Shuffle, so I'm just like in a weird space right now, but I think November I want to be reading Honey, so I'm thinking that November will be a better month. And also I've decided, I've said this maybe 10 times on my channel, but I mean it this time. I almost did it tonight, but I was like, you know what, I'm gonna film my wrap up instead. I think I know what I want to do with my bookshelves. It's been months of pondering. If you've been following this, me reflecting on what I want to do with my bookshelves, I think what I'm going to do, like, genre. Because alphabetizing was not the move. Do not recommend. It was I tried it. You can kind of see me up there. Can you tell I was like trying to... Why can I not move my finger? I was trying to do it, but it's not the T. And then so now I'm thinking if I do like my classics, older backlist up there, like collections of classics, then maybe do like nonfiction, memoir, poetry, then have all my short stories in one place, then like general fiction, and then group like different authors together. So I want like all my cusks in one place, all my Roonies, all my Moshbags. Like, I think that's going to be nice for me to do. And I want to see like what nonfiction I own and also like what short stories I own. So I think that'll be the T. Anyways, that's my October. Hope you enjoyed it, and I'll catch you in the next one. Didn't drink my beer. Classic me. Cheers.